Здравствуйте, дорогие участники встречи. Меня зовут Шихер Анна, я заместитель руководителя факультета психологии в Высшей школе «Среда» обучения. Я рада приветствовать вас на сегодняшнем открытии цикла встреч «Вне границ». Сегодня мы действительно открываем целый ряд мероприятий, которые будут проходить в течение июля, августа и сентября. Сами встречи будут проводиться с ведущими экспертами из разных сфер практики, профессора ведущих университетов, на которых у вас будет возможность узнать передовые исследования, передовые практические аспекты деятельности специалистов. Поэтому рада вас приветствовать на нашем мероприятии. Факультет психологии, в принципе, в Высшей школе «Среда» обучения обучает более 5000 студентов из разных уголков планеты, и дистанционный формат здесь в том числе действительно помогает нам действовать вне границ, получать знания вне границ, общаться вне границ и узнавать самую современную, новую информацию о интересующих нас феноменах. Кроме этого, выпускники наших программ — это практические психологи, психотерапевты, которые развиваются активно в профессии и являются психологами-консультантами, открывают психологические центры. Сейчас, на данный момент, мы на факультете открываем продолжаем наборы наших программ на осень, поэтому если вдруг вам будет интересно, вы можете писать об этом в чат, информация также будет приходить рассылками. Ну, а сейчас для того, чтобы поскорее перейти к цели нашей с вами сегодня встречи, конечно же, хотелось открыть цикл встреч, и действительно в рамках него у вас будет возможность познакомиться с передовыми исследованиями, и чтобы не затягивать, представляю сегодняшнего спикера. Сегодня мы с вами узнаем и погрузимся в мир эмоциональной импульсивности при расстройствах настроения. С нами сегодня на площадке Шерри Джонсон, профессор университета Беркли, специалист в сфере клинической психологии. Кроме этого, лауреат многочисленных наград в сфере научных исследований и преподавания, специалист в сфере изучения эмоциональных реакций и механизмов импульсивности. Поэтому рекомендую вам внимательно погружаться в сегодняшний процесс. На протяжении всего занятия вы можете оставлять свои вопросы в чате. Уверена, что на многие вы получите ответы в процессе мероприятия. Кроме этого, ряд вопросов будет отобран, и в конце встречи мы сможем задать эти вопросы Шерри и получить ответ от, так сказать, первоисточника. Вот. Поэтому по регламенту нашей встречи час 15 идет вводная часть, теоретическая, разбор материала, и далее 15 минут выделяется на серию вопросов, поэтому не стесняйтесь, задавайте свои вопросы в чат. И что же, для удобства с нами на площадке также есть синхронный переводчик, поэтому ближайший час действительно будет наполнен погружением в тему эмоциональной импульсивности. Также, если вдруг на протяжении встречи у вас будут возникать вопросы по поводу поступления, вы их также можете писать в чат, он будет внимательно просматриваться. Большое спасибо за внимание и передаю слово Шерри. Успешной встречи!
Good evening. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to share my screen and switch to slides. But I want to thank Anna for the lovely introduction and everybody who's been helping to organize this. And I just feel very, very honored to be here today. So what I want to talk about today is people who tend to respond very impulsively to emotions. And I'm going to definitely allow time for questions at the end because I'd really like to have the dialogue with you. I'm just thrilled to have this chance to talk with you. I don't have any financial conflicts to report. And just a little bit of an outline of where I'm going to go today. I'm going to start with some definitions. I'm going to try and convince you that this is a dimension that's really important for understanding many different psychopathologies. I'm going to try and explain some of what we know about neurocognitive variables that might be part of the mechanism. And then I'm going to shift gears and talk about how we could use this information to plan out treatments. So if I'm being confusing, please stop me ask questions along the way. But again, I'll leave a lot of time for questions at the end. Okay, so here I am. I study impulsiveness, and it turns out that everybody I know who studies impulsiveness hates the word. Why? Because it's kind of an umbrella term, and it refers to many, many different things, which are only slightly correlated or related to each other. The only one of them I'm going to really focus on today is a tendency for people to kind of respond to emotions in an impulsive way. I'm drawing a lot on work from Whiteside and Lynham, who developed the UPS scale way back 20 years ago. What they did is they took a large set of items and they gave them to a lot of people, and they did statistical factor analysis to say, well, how many different types of impulsivity are there? And out of that, one second, I'm just going to move a little bit of dials out of my way here. They identified that there were separate items that were about tendencies to act rashly during states of mostly negative emotions. So there were people who said, yeah, I don't really struggle with these other kinds of impulsivity, but once I'm in a bad mood, I say and do things that I really regret. Now, we all have times when we wish we were better people when we're really upset, but these folks said, no, it happens again and again and again. So urgency. Now, why do I call it emotion related? Well, it turns out that in addition to these negative responses, citers came along 6 years later and said, you know, there's also people who struggle when they're in good moods, positive mood states, and they do things and say things they regret when they're really excited. So those two together, I call emotion related impulsivity. And it turns out they're pretty correlated with each other. People who have problems with negative mood states often have problems with positive mood states, but they don't tend to say, look, when I'm not in an emotion state, I have these other problems. Okay. What do these scales look like? So they're simple self-report scales. I'll have to ask you folks later if they're available in Russian, the negative urgency scale has items like sometimes when I feel bad, I can't seem to stop what I'm doing, even though it's making me feel worse. When I'm upset, I act without thinking. When I feel rejected, I'll often say things that I later regret. Positive urgency, very similar items. Like when I'm very happy, I can't seem to stop myself from doing things that can have bad consequences. Or I tend to do things that cause problems in my life, or I tend to lose control when I'm in a great mood. Sort of the, oh, I can't believe I did that. They're not being their normal self once they're in a state of high emotion. Now, it's not just a self-report problem because there are parent and interview-based ways to assess this, and those show some very similar correlations with outcomes. Now, so Whiteside and Lynham developed this scale, they publish it, and very quickly people begin to publish a huge number, Don Lynham in particular, but many, many people jump into studying this. And at this point, there have been more than 1,000 peer-reviewed articles focused on the UPS scale and this kind of phenomenon. And again, it seems to work. One of the things I like about it is that people have shown that it does predict what happens when people are in emotion states. So whether we bring people in the lab and give them a mood induction, or we follow them in daily life and do what we call ecological momentary assessment, where you're pinging people again and again to see how their moods fluctuate. Whatever techniques you use, negative urgency predicts worse symptoms during negative emotion states. And positive urgency predicts worse symptoms like drinking more, drinking too heavily during good mood states. So they do seem to capture these problems when people are okay, then they're in a mood state and they slip and they make these mistakes and they're more symptomatic. So what is it? I mean, I just got fascinated with my colleague, Charles Carver, with wondering like, well, what is driving this? Now, in 2 articles sometime back, we began, we began to apply dual process models. So dual process theory has been around for also more than 20 years. Many different authors have written about this, and it's this idea of a brain-based systems. They interact, but that you can basically be very reflexive or more reflective. We all have both modes going all the time, but they're in balance. Sometimes one is a little higher, sometimes one is a little lower, and people vary in which one is a little higher or lower on average. So both can guide behavior in the same direction, or sometimes they may conflict. But when you don't have this kind of reflective top-down system, the person essentially runs on automatic pilot, responding not to their plans, not to their big long-term goals, but to kind of falling prey to their habits, their urges, their emotional cues of the moment. So they're just responding with reflex to what's there. Now, if that's true, if what this is really about is your tendency to respond with reflex, then maybe it happens with more than just what's on the urgency scale. So urgency scales capture behavior, but we thought, well, what if you also can't constrain fluctuations in your motivation? Kind of being too revved up and chasing things, and you can't control that, or not having any motivation and you can't get yourself back up off the couch. We also thought it might have an influence on how people constrained their thinking in the face of emotions. So we thought, well, let's look at this broader idea of, is this somehow a big picture failure of constraint over emotion? So we put together items that captured poor constraint over emotion. So giving up, can't overcome lethargy or passivity when you're in a sad state. But also, sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble with my slides. I'm going to back up for a minute. Okay, so the other thing we tried to put items together around was, once you're in an emotion state, does that drive how you think about the world and yourself? So like when you're in a lousy mood, you think, I'm a miserable human being and things will never get better. When you're in a great mood, you think, I could take on the world, I can conquer everything. And then for comparison, we included items that were just impulsivity without any emotion reference to make sure that that was a separate issue. Self-control, attentional impulsivity, like distractibility, and then what we did is a factor analysis to see how these different kinds of problems with constraint hang together or not. And what we saw is that there were actually 2 kinds of emotion-related impulsivity. This factor 1 was really about, once you're in a negative mood, once you're in a terrible, sad mood, you couldn't constrain your motivation, you couldn't constrain your thoughts. These were folks who, when they were in a negative mood, think things like, the world is always going to be miserable, I'm a horrible person, couldn't get off the couch. And then this is the kind of set of scales we've been talking about, positive urgency, negative urgency. We've called this feelings trigger action because it also includes kind of, when you're in a mood state, do you tend to respond with reflexes? And then this is kind of our control form of impulsivity. None of these have to do with emotion states. So the take home here is that there might be 2 kinds of failures of constraint over emotion. Okay, so what have I told you so far? Just to recap, emotion-related impulsivity is pretty distinct from other forms of impulsivity. These folks only tend to have problems during emotion states. They have problems during good and bad emotion states. And there's 2 kinds of it. One is the lack of constraint over speech and behavior. One is the lack of constraint over motivation and thought. They're separable. They're not that highly correlated. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about how dual process models shaped our view of what emotion-related impulsivity is. But now what I want to do is talk about how it relates to outcomes. This is a really helpful review that covers, this is actually a 2008 emotion outcomes. This is a 2015 meta-analysis showing that negative urgency, if you look at these correlations, 0.34 with various kinds of psychopathologies compared to less than half of that effect size for each of these other kinds of impulsivity. Positive urgency, where they had results, was similar, and they could see those effects across drinking, drug use, depression, suicidality, anxiety, particularly big effects for this personality disorder. So negative urgency looks like where you should look if you're looking for how impulsivity relates to psychopathology. Negative urgency and positive urgency. It's almost the same correlation here. Now, it's not just cross-sectional work. All of these articles are longitudinal studies where they've taken negative and positive urgency and measured them at one point in time and predicted increases over time in many different kinds of psychopathologies. So it's predictive. And weirdly, it's not just the kind of acting out stuff like gambling and drinking and drug use. It also looked like it might be tied to depression. So in early work, people said, you know, people with higher depressive symptoms show higher negative urgency scores. So we thought, can we see this with lifetime major depression? We recruited people with lifetime major depressive disorder. We did diagnostic interviews to verify that. People without it, we gave our three-factor scale, three-factor impulsivity scale. And then we used regression models to see how depression status related to impulsivity. And here we wanted to really control for alcohol problems because those two run hand in hand. And we didn't want this to be, we wanted to know if it could be explained by alcohol issues. What we saw is even when you control for alcohol, there were significant links between impulsivity and emotion impulsivity, this pervasive influence of feelings in particular, and depression. We also looked at, well, does that hold up even after people have remitted and their symptoms are gone? And it did. So pervasive influence of feelings, feelings trigger action. So this is the kind of poor constraint over thoughts and motivation. This is the poor constraint over actions and speech. Both were problems for people with major depression, even after they'd recovered. With Rose Decker, she did her master's thesis and replicated this with a larger sample of 60 people with major depressive disorder, 100 controls. And again, same profile where pervasive influence of feelings was more elevated than other forms for people with depression. And we saw that same effect hold even once they were well. A little bit of a shakeup here where lack of follow-through in this sample was also a concern, but both forms of emotion-related impulsivity were elevated for people with depression even after recovery. And intriguingly, even if we stuck to just the questions about what happens when you're in a great mood, people with depression still said, yeah, I lose control over what I do. Now, again, you could say, well, yeah, but depressed folks, they often struggle with things like alcohol, substance, gambling. What if you control for that? Does it go away? This is a path model where we control for different kinds of psychopathologies. What you'll see is we still had a huge effect linking pervasive influence of feelings to depression. Well, okay, what about some of the really troubling outcomes that can go along with depression? We wanted to look at self-harm. So non-suicidal self-injury, people who are hurting themselves without the attempt to die. This was a large study by Riley, not our team, of over 1,000 women where they found that negative urgency measured during that first year of college predicted whether these women were going to begin to harm themselves during college, with a pretty big odds ratio. It wasn't the thing that drove whether they were going to keep doing it, but it drove whether they started doing it. Also, Kassin, in a long-term study following people from age 10 all the way through 25, at every time period, the people who at some point engaged in a suicide attempt, these folks showed higher levels of urgency scores than the non-attempters over time. And that controlled for even things like trauma. So it seems really important whether people are doing these regrettable things during depression or other kind of negative mood states. We wanted to look at the 3-factor scale because we thought, well, maybe that'll give us a little more specificity. So with Randy Auerbach, we assessed 230 adolescents in residential treatment. Intriguingly, it was pervasive influence of feelings that was really elevated for people who were ideating, even if you controlled for other kinds of impulsivity, depression, anxiety. So these folks who were thinking about suicide said, yeah, I don't have good control over my thoughts and motivation. But then among ideators, those who did an attempt, who actually hurt themselves with an intent to die, they were the ones that had high scores on feelings trigger action. They were the ones that said, I can't control what I say and do once I'm in that state. For years, I've looked at bipolar disorder, and I wanted to look at that here. So in the US, we use the DSM-5 criteria, which require just one lifetime episode of mania. And usually what you see is these folks have their lows and then their highs and then their lows. We really wanted to make sure we were catching people outside of episodes. So we've recruited people and we followed them for up to a year to make sure that we caught one of these periods of remission that had lasted at least 2 months. And then we said, okay, over these last 2 months, tell us about your levels of impulsivity. So we bring them in, we diagnose them, we follow them every month with standardized interviews to assess symptoms. And then we recruited a control group that didn't have bipolar disorder, but they were matched on age and gender, anxiety disorders, substance use disorders, and we give them all impulsivity measures. We gave them a battery of impulsivity measures about what they were like in the 2 months they've been recovered. Standardize the scores so it'd be easier to compare them. And here's what we saw. Our folks with bipolar disorder were reporting lots of different problems. Like almost every scale, there were significant differences in impulsivity, but they said where they really struggled was that they tended to have poor control over what they did during emotion states, and particularly during positive emotion states. So it looks like they're more elevated on urgency and positive urgency compared to other kinds of impulsivity. Now, some of that you might say, yeah, but they're probably just thinking back to their mood episodes. So what we did is we looked for samples of people at risk for mania who'd only had kind of minor symptoms of mania during their lifetime, saw the same profile. So same kind of question we had in depression of what does it tell us about how people with bipolar disorder do over time in their lives? What does it mean if they have this high level of impulsivity? So with Sarah Victor, who is still a colleague, we looked at 90 people with remitted bipolar 1 disorder to see if this is what got them in trouble. We looked at quality of life, so how much they felt satisfied with different domains of their life, but also functioning, how well they were doing and like holding a job and having friendships and maintaining their household. And among our remitted bipolar folks, positive urgency predicted a worse quality of life, worse functioning, pretty big effect sizes. And we could see those effects even when we controlled for other forms of impulsivity. And when we controlled for their medication status, their symptoms, their history, comorbid conditions, this seemed to be the driver. anger and aggression. So not everybody with bipolar disorder is angry or aggressive, but 15% of people with bipolar disorder in the US in a representative study said they'd had physical fights in the past year. That's incredibly high compared to the general population. They also were more likely to have a violent legal conviction in the Dunedin, Australia study. And in a large US study, they were much more likely, more than 8 times as likely to say that they had threatened somebody with a gun. Now, I want to be super clear that anger is one of the defining symptoms of mania. So it could be an episode issue because recovery rates after people recover, violence rates are within the normal range for most people. But some people with bipolar disorder say they continue to feel like they have really high levels of anger and verbal aggression. And it's those folks that I wanted to understand. So could it help us understand this? We recruited 58 people with bipolar I disorder, followed them again until they'd been remitted for a couple months, and looked at whether impulsivity would help us understand their individual differences in levels of aggression. And what we saw is high correlations, even when we restricted it to questions about how do you respond to positive mood states? Do you have trouble with your speech and action once you're in a positive mood state? So robust, large correlations with verbal aggression, physical aggression, anger, hostility, seemed like this was really tied to whether they were struggling. What about suicidality? About a quarter of people with bipolar I disorder worldwide report that they've had a suicide attempt. More than half report suicidal ideation in the past year. This is the psychiatric condition with the highest rate of death from suicide, with Northern European national cohort studies suggesting that about 8% of men, 5% of women with bipolar disorder die from suicide. It's really a worry because this is with our current medication profiles. And yet, when people looked at like a scale like the Barrett that didn't measure emotion in relationship to impulsivity, there's really no big effect of impulsivity on suicidality. We wanted to ask then, could emotion-related impulsivity help explain suicidality? Same kind of design, we recruit people, follow them until they're well, measure emotion-related impulsivity, and we see that both positive urgency and negative urgency relate to suicidality, related to suicidal ideation severity, self-harm, suicide attempts. Mostly similar effects, except that ideation was more tied to negative urgency than positive urgency. All right, so what have I said? Thank you for your patience in this section. What I've said is that emotion-related impulsivity is more closely tied to psychopathology than other facets of impulsivity are. And interestingly, it's important for these internalizing conditions. So in cross-sectional and longitudinal work, it's linked to depression, self-harm, bipolar disorder, and poor outcomes within bipolar disorder. Study after study, we can control for comorbid conditions, current symptoms, medication, other forms of impulsivity. It's still there. There's some importance about looking at the different forms of emotion-related impulsivity because depression and suicidal ideation are more closely to emotions driving impulsive thought. Mania, aggression, and suicidal actions are more closely tied to emotion driving impulsive behavior and speech. So what is it? First thing you might think, if it's so important, is, well, maybe they're just more emotional. So we looked at emotion. This is a UC Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley student winning the Olympics. So we showed people clips of their, classmate winning the Olympics to see if they seemed like they got more excited than other people. And whether we measured their self-ratings, their psychophysiology, their facial behavior, nah, they weren't more excited. It did not look like they were more emotional. And that's now one of a set of studies where people have brought people into the lab, given them failure experiences, stress experiences, success experiences, and measured very carefully. Do they look any different in what they say, what their physiology looks like, what their faces look like? No, they are not more emotional than other people. So emotion generation, not the story, not what's going on. Now, there's also, this is Matt Elliott, who's helping me look at the imaging, neuroimaging literature. And there you see that generally they don't look any different when they're exposed to emotion stimuli. But across 3 studies, you show them emotion stimuli and they're showing more of an orbital frontal cortex, right here, kind of response. Well, that's really interesting to us because the OFC is related to your ability to then downregulate your emotions. So maybe you get to the same point of emotion, but you can't bring it back down, would be one idea. In fact, King did a daily study tracking people over time and seeing that once people with urgency had an emotion state, they reported more difficulties with their emotion regulation. So they didn't get more emotional, but they couldn't bring it back down into check. So then there's these interesting imaging studies where they ask people to view emotion stimuli, and then they look at what's happening in the brain when they tell them, please regulate your response to this. And they see that they're showing more of a dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the side of the prefrontal cortex response, suggesting they had to work harder to do this. And even when they're doing that regulation, their amygdala response stays higher, which is a signal that they're having a more intense, prolonged emotion response. So they can't downregulate very well. They're working hard to downregulate, and it's not working for them. So it's not a larger emotion response per se. They come up to the same level, but they can't bring it back down very well. Now, turns out that if you want to regulate your emotions, you use executive function. You use these cognitive kind of processes, and in particularly, you use response inhibition. It's a core measure of constraint, central and dual process models, and response inhibition and emotion regulation use the same brain regions. So could that be it? Well, we did a meta-analysis. We did a review of the literature on studies of response inhibition. And what we saw is that there was a correlation across studies in the effect of negative urgency being tied to more troubles with response inhibition. It's only there in the clinical studies. When we looked at the non-serious samples, like student samples, it's not there. So how do you make sense of that? Well, we thought maybe what's happening is you can have a little bit of this urgency or emotion-related impulsivity. You'd be fine. Your executive function would be fine, until you tend to be a person with a high level of emotion-related impulsivity. And then we would see these problems in response inhibition. So it's more of a decay at the high end. So we did our own studies twice with undergraduates, gave them the urgency scales, gave them once a negative mood induction, once a positive mood induction. Then we looked at response inhibition. Then we asked the question, is it curvilinear? And in fact, it was. So after positive and negative emotions, inductions in the lab, people with emotion-triggered impulsivity showed problems with response inhibition, but only when they had serious enough problems with this form of impulsivity. Now, what's up with that? I mean, all throughout, I've been talking about positive urgency, negative urgency. So there's this dimension we call valence, from happy, pleased to sad, gloomy. But people also talk about the important part of of emotion states is also to think about high arousal to low arousal. And I think what's happening for these folks is it's this high arousal, good or bad, that's a problem. So being enthusiastic, they lose control. Being in a state of fear, nerves, jitters, they lose control. I don't think they're really losing control down here. Well, we've known for a long time that a little bit of norepinephrine, which is very correlated with the subjective sense of arousal and with psychophysiological arousal, a little bit of that helps you do better on tasks. But too much of that arousal, that too much norepinephrine, and people begin to fall apart. It's a curvilinear effect. And so what we thought might be happening is just for these folks, they start to fall apart with a little less arousal, a little less norepinephrine, and they begin this kind of decline. Well, we looked at that, Jen Pearlstein and I, using a response inhibition task and measuring pupil across every trial. Now, pupil dilation is really interesting. So how dilated your pupils are is innervated by norepinephrine, and it's correlated with subjective ratings of arousal. But we could measure it by the millisecond and see how minor shifts across a task related to how you were doing on that task. And you'd expect that for most of us, a little bit more arousal, a little bit of pupil dilation would be great for our performance. We thought for these folks, not so much. It wouldn't happen that way. And in fact, that's what we saw. For folks with low levels of feelings trigger action, they showed this kind of increase in their performance, did better as they had more arousal. A little perkiness, good for you. But our folks with the higher levels of feelings trigger action began to decline with more arousal. So for those high in emotion-related impulsivity, arousal seems to drive poor response inhibition performance. It's not there for other kinds of impulsivity. It seems like it's really the problem for these folks. Now, what's interesting about this is that now there have been hundreds of studies of many other neurocognitive variables don't seem correlated. So its response inhibition is very unique in showing these effects in relationship to urgency. And response inhibition, to do effective response inhibition, so if you're doing well on any of the response inhibition tasks, we see this cognitive control network in the brain light up. Lateral prefrontal cortex, anterior cingulate, striatum, frontal and parietal, frontal striatal regions. Those same regions activate when people are effectively regulating their emotions. So cognitive control network of the brain, really key. So we can look at this. And it turns out that those same regions of the brain seem to respond differentially for people with emotion-related impulsivity during a response inhibition task, but only during negative pictures. So they're having struggles with this cognitive control network when we ask them to engage in response inhibition and there's negative emotion in the task or stimuli. There have been several studies of response inhibition in people with high and low urgency. And when they don't do anything to manipulate emotion, nothing looks different. But when they do manipulate emotion states, this is the study we were just looking at, you see that people had to kind of activate their cognitive control network more to kind of perform well. It's like they had to work that muscle a little harder than other people. Same thing when people have used reward-related exciting stimuli. You see they had to activate their cognitive control network more. One study it's lower, but so overall there's something differentially happening with cognitive control network. So whether you're looking at the behavioral literature, the neurobiological literature, emotion-related impulsivity seems tied to response inhibition deficits. Now, it's not always there. That effect is more present when their impulsivity is severe or when you're doing something to heighten emotion or arousal. Now, the effects are not that large, they're pretty small, and it could be that there's more than one mechanism, or that our tasks are just not that precise. So that's the current focus of our work. We've been gathering data for 5 years. We're about to analyze it to see if we can improve those models. But still, response inhibition seems like part of the problem, and that's important because you use that same circuitry to regulate your emotions. And it seems like the context is that they particularly struggle with response inhibition during periods of hyperarousal. So can we do anything about this? So my grad student, Andrew Peckham, who thought, well, maybe we can try and train response inhibition capacity, other executive control capacity, and reduce emotion-related impulsivity. So he did a combined cognitive training protocol having people do both to see if we made a difference. He recruited people with high scores on feelings trigger action, assessed them at baseline, assigned them to wait list or immediate treatment, did just six training sessions around executive control involving both working memory and response inhibition, and then retested them to see if we'd made a difference in their emotion-related impulsivity. So in waitlist, people didn't change. So nothing about time or repeated assessment made a difference. But when we looked at the people who were enrolled in his treatment, we saw a significant drop from baseline to after training in emotion-related impulsivity and particularly in feelings trigger action. And that continued through the next weeks of follow-up, suggesting that they continued to get better. Pretty nice effect size here. So that was nice to see. We've also wondered, though, can we use this to do cognitive behavioral treatment? And when we started to think about this, we decided let's target aggression as our outcome. Why? Well, it's a really highly correlated with emotion-related impulsivity across community and clinical samples. And also aggression is so distinctive. It's kind of one of those countable behavioral things. It's a very clear behavioral outcome. So Guggenheim Foundation gave us money to recruit people who had both high emotion-related impulsivity and were engaging frequently in aggressive behavior. Now, first thing we thought is, well, okay, we often tell people who are aggressive, like, oh, stop and reflect. And we thought that's never going to work. These folks can't use their prefrontal cortex very well once they're in a state of high arousal, high emotion. Let's not tell them to think hard during that moment because the wiring isn't going to work very well for that. So instead, we thought, well, let's train them up. Let's test them and show them their scores on emotion-related impulsivity. Explain that they're not generally impulsive, but we have to focus in on these moments when they're in a kind of high emotion state, high arousal. Train them to identify high arousal moments. Get them thinking about what sets it off for them. Teach them really quick, good strategies to self-calm. Gather data in their daily life to see how those different coping strategies work, and then give them personalized feedback about their coping strategies and use that to do something we call implementation intentions, which is just basically pre-plan what you're going to do when you get upset or hyper. Now, that's also simple that we thought we can do this online. And we can supplement having online modules with pinging them on their cell phone 4 times a day. So that's what we did. We sent them, emotion monitoring, coping practice, logging how well that coping worked by phone. We recruited 212 people. More than 12% of them actually had legal problems because of their aggression. And they were reporting more than 50 times in the past 3 months, on average, they'd been aggressive, and more than 4 times in the past week, they'd been aggressive. So they were struggling, and the incidents were not minor. When we did interviews, we were sort of shocked at what people were going through in their daily life. We did, the green is a self-report, the Bus-Perry aggression scale. The purple is an interview. And what this graph shows you is that, listen, from during waitlist, when people aren't getting treatment, they really didn't change in their aggression. But once they did the program from pre-treatment to post-treatment, we saw nice changes that were sustained over time, and even for some people increased over time. Now, the changes were for verbal aggression, property aggression, physical aggression, and by follow-up, they were even reporting they were less aggressive towards themselves, less likely to engage in harming themselves. So, and the results are holding across 3 months of follow-up. They were holding even, we published a small study of people with bipolar disorder with this intervention, and it was working for them. So we're going to keep looking at this intervention. We're looking at refining it for adolescents, for people with self-harm as their primary concern, seeing what we can do about this. So far, what I've said is that I really think emotion-related impulsivity is important. It's important for not just externalizing problems like gambling and substance, but it's also really important for mood disorders. And it's not just that it's high for people with mood disorders, it predicts some of the most troubling outcomes they go through. A lot of different theories, more than 100 studies trying to figure out what it is, but we think that one of the problems involved is response inhibition deficits, particularly during states of high arousal. And so we're working on interventions to help people understand the problem, have stronger response inhibition, reduce high arousal, and use strategies when they're really hyper that don't depend heavily on cognitive control, executive function. So I have huge thanks for many, many, many people who have helped with this project, in particular for more than 10 years, Charles Carver, who recently died, but has been core to the development and work, and many, many other grad students and colleagues who've put their energy into this. So with that, I think what I want to do is stop my share and answer questions and see what I can do to help make sense of this, and also hear how it fits for your culture. I'm not quite sure what impulsivity looks like for you, and I'm happy to just brainstorm. Maybe we can start with questions that would help things be as clear as possible and then go from there. Thank you very, very much. Yeah, it means that as soon as somebody says the word impulsivity, I want to know, what do you mean by that? Because the different forms are not very correlated. So to give an example, one form of impulsivity is I can't control my attention. Another form is I can't seem to motivate to finish tasks. And those forms are not very related to whether people have emotion-related impulsivity. So another way of thinking about that is that the people with emotion-related impulsivity, when they're not in an emotion state, they usually don't look that impulsive. They're okay. They can regulate themselves pretty well until the emotions come along. Does that help, Anna? Sure. So less than inability to accept, let's talk about trouble regulating in the face of it. So imagine an adolescent kid and their mom upsets them and they say something horrible. They really explode, right? They say something that they're like, oh, I can't believe I did that. And the mom can't believe they did that. Well, some people don't outgrow that. So their boss says something to them, gives them some feedback, puts them in a negative mood. And all of a sudden they're saying things to their boss that are completely wrong and inappropriate. And maybe they're losing their job over it. So those are impulsive responses to negative mood states. the people we're studying have those responses not just once or twice in a year, but day in, day out. They are saying and doing things that later they really regret. So, for example, parents who say very mean things to their kids and then feel horrified that they said something when they were really angry. And it happens again and again, and they don't feel like they can get control over it. So it's not that it's so unusual to lose control during a negative emotion state. It's that for these people, it happens way too often and way too big. So for example, one of the women that we first worked with, somebody cut her off driving on the highway. And, you know, we all might get upset. It was a Mack truck, a big truck, and it upset her. But her response was to speed ahead, get in front of the truck, and then jump out in front of them on the highway. And later you think, she thought, oh my God, I could have been killed. But only later did she think, I could have been killed. Now, that's hopefully the negative emotion side makes sense. But what about positive emotions? So there we see people doing things like they're in a great mood and they drink too much. They're in a great mood and they gamble too much. They're in a great mood and they make jokes about other people that later they're like, oh, that was painful. I should have never said that. They say these things that they should have never said. And those things happen again and again and again. And so you get this sense of people, because these two things go together, people who, once they're all kind of hyper or revved up, they're saying and doing things that reflect the emotion, but they really feel badly about later. And they're doing it again and again and again. It's a great question. I think there have been three themes. The first is to understand what this form of impulsivity predicts. So being able to show that it's important not just for things like gambling, but that it's important for things like depression and suicide and self-harm and functioning in bipolar disorder. So that's been theme one, is showing that it matters. I think we've kind of done that now, honestly, like we keep tweaking it, but I think we've put that side, some pretty good evidence out there. So question number two has been, well, then what is it? Like, what is the mechanism? Because if we understood the mechanism, we might be able to have more precise prediction, just like you said. But then the whole point of understanding the mechanisms is that should give us a way to kind of do better intervention. So for example, quit telling the people who are aggressive because it's, oh, think harder during that moment or be more reflective. They can't. We might target response inhibition, or we might target those high arousal moments. Or for example, if we really do find that this is a norepinephrine problem, that might suggest different medication approaches that would be helpful for people. So I would say the heart of what we're trying to do right now is to go back and forth between better understanding of mechanisms and then turning around and saying, okay, if that's the mechanism, what would we do for treatment? And in that process, one of the things you hope is that as you try these treatments, so for example, if you target training response inhibition, and you see that the people who have more of a response inhibition gain have more control over their impulsivity, it's another test of the theory. So the intervention work hopefully informs us about mechanisms, the mechanisms work informs us about treatment, and we'll just keep going back and forth between translation of mechanism to treatment. That's the hope. Oh, that's a great question. Thank you. And I'm sorry we didn't talk much about this. So it turns out, I mean, what you have to do is activate your parasympathetic nervous system. And there is a lot of research on how to do that. So for example, deep paced breathing at like 7 breaths a minute rapidly brings online parasympathetic nervous system activation. So we teach people breathing exercises. We teach them muscle relaxation, which no one ever wants to do muscle relaxation exercises, but it helps them think about what state are they trying to get to, and helps them think about, okay, what are the things in your life that help you get to that state? And it helps them notice when they're not in that state. So for some people, then it's more meditation or exercise or walking. One thing that I find absolutely fascinating is that physically, another way to bring online parasympathetic nervous system activation is rocking. If you rock rhythmically back and forth, you actually have a boost in your parasympathetic nervous system activation, which is fascinating because we rock babies. People with developmental disabilities often rock when they're upset. People love rocking chairs, but we don't think about that as having a profound influence on our psychophysiology, and it very rapidly does. Throughout our work, we try to give people ideas of these kinds of self-calming things. And then we say, we don't know what will work best for you. Let's test out the things that you want to try. So we teach them different skills. We have little modules on different skills. We say, you probably have your own things. Let's have you practice them for this next couple of weeks. Whenever you're upset, try practicing a coping strategy, and then we give them feedback on which of those things worked for them. We've been expanding what we do cognitively there, helping people. We don't want them to try and reason with themselves, use logic to get out of a kind of negative emotion state, but we want them to recognize that sometimes your thoughts are your own worst enemy. So we try and teach them strategies for distracting for an hour, so that the person who's ruminating and going over really negative things again and again in their head can maybe try and break that cycle. So it's very classic cognitive behavioral therapy. There's nothing unique about it. It's just bundled a little differently. Yeah, well, going way back, we've looked at some of the things that might be happening genetically and in the environment. We've done a set of studies that suggest that one thing that's true for people who have this is they have lower serotonergic function. The neurotransmitter serotonin seems to not function as well for them. We've seen that when we looked at genetic polymorphisms. And then we used that to do a dietary intervention to feed people diets that were richer in tryptophan, the precursor to serotonin. And when we did that, their impulsivity levels dropped. So I think sometimes it starts a bit with serotonin, small effects. The other thing is that early life trauma is tied to people having more trouble with emotion-related impulsivity. Now, that one could be happening through biological mechanisms because serious early life trauma influences brain development, but then it also influences how people respond to really important emotion stimuli. So I think trauma maybe operates in a lot of different ways. For whatever reason, though, we think these folks have a poor biological capacity to use their prefrontal cortex to downregulate. And to use cognitive control once they're in a state of high arousal. Maybe that's not so surprising if you think, well, for everybody, once arousal gets too high, that makes it harder to have that cognitive control system work. It's just that their system's more fragile, so it takes less arousal for them to begin to kind of fall apart in their ability to use their prefrontal cortex to downregulate. So we think it really is kind of the biological and social phenomenon that drive a weakness in that cognitive control system that then means that once they're in this high emotion state, it's just harder for them to regulate. And then you can imagine, just like your question suggests, that if that happens to you again and again and again, like let's imagine you are a parent and every time your adolescent kid upsets you, you say and do things that you really regret. Now you have this very conflictual relationship with your kid, and you're faced with more situations where you might lose control. So I do think it spirals on itself, but I think that there's some very early life and even genetic influences that set the stage for this to happen. I hope that answers the question, but feel free to ask again about these. These are very, very good questions, and I love talking about them. So feel free to ask again.
Шерри, подскажите, эмоциональная импульсивность – врожденный или приобретенный синдром? Если второе, то в чем его причины?
I think it's both. I mean, I think that there are important genetic influences, but they're not the only way this happens. That I think serious trauma can create this. And probably the worst case would be both, right? You have serious trauma and you have genetic wiring, genetically driven wiring that kind of contribute to this. And then I think the third thing we haven't really done a good job of thinking about, and I would love to do more work on this, is like imagine yourself as a parent and you have a kid who maybe was born with a kind of weaker serotonergic system, poor cognitive control system, maybe tough things happen to them as a kid. So there you are, you have a kid by age 10, 12 that shows higher levels of emotion-related impulsivity. What are the things you as a parent can do to help that kid learn extra skills? And you know, my hope is that these tools that we're working on they're so simple, they're so straight ahead that I don't think they're going to be that hard for adolescent kids to learn. So that's one of the next things we're trying to do, is to see, can we train adolescents to use these skills of know that the mistakes you make are often when you're in a state of high arousal. Learn to recognize when you're in a state of high arousal. Learn what works for you, what doesn't work for you in those moments. Plan to kind of plug it in. You know, that all, it's so common sensey that sometimes I feel silly. Like, this is not so groundbreaking, but maybe that's the hope, is that if we can teach these really simple things, and then we can help parents teach these really simple things for kids who have this, maybe that's going to help. So I think genes, trauma, and then hopefully something about what people teach you to do about recognizing and coping with states of high arousal.
Вы проводили исследования взаимосвязи эмоциональной импульсивности и синдрома дефицита внимания и гиперактивности?
We are just starting to look at that. I have a student who's all focused on ADHD, and we've been assembling her data set in the last week. So ask me in a month. It turns out, you know, we think of ADHD as being very much about just, oh, they can't pay attention, it's not about emotion, but there are people who are saying, wow, no. ADHD kids have many more problems when they're in a state of high emotion than in other states. So we're following up that theory and looking a little bit more carefully at emotion and non-emotion related impulsivity in ADHD and in different forms of ADHD. Stay tuned. I don't have my answer, but I love the question because it's something that we've been really wondering about.
Эмоциональную импульсивность можно сравнить с раздражительностью?
Yes. That's a great question too. We find that, okay, so irritability I think of as like sort of low level aggression. Maybe you snipe and get over it. Maybe you just feel this sense of anger, but don't always express it. So we've done a lot of studies of different anger and aggression. And it seems like what this does is that when people are in that kind of state of like frustration or emotion, they're much more likely to express the irritability into verbal aggression or physical aggression. So they feel irritated, they're much more likely to express it. So is it just irritability? I would say no, because they also have problems when they're in other emotion states. So for the folks who have emotion-related impulsivity, irritability getting expressed is only one of their problems. They also have problems like when they're really excited, they're making mistakes. When they're really sad, they can't regulate that. So irritability is just one way it goes. But if you're a person who has emotion-related impulsivity and you tend to have a lot of frustration, that's going to be your number one problem, is the way that you're expressing that frustration and anger. Yeah, I think it's very, very related. But the one thing I would say about aggression is that not all forms of aggression are a loss of control. So we talk about emotion-based aggression and then coercion-based aggression, that there are people who engage in aggression very deliberately, where what they really want to do is control and intimidate the other person. And there's nothing about it they regret. They do not think, oh, I can't believe I did that. They're like, yeah, I showed them and I'm in charge and I'm powerful. So for them, it's not a regrettable impulse, it's a strategic behavior. And I think those folks, that's not emotion-related impulsivity. So I think we're trying to work with the folks who say like, I said this thing that was so nasty and so ugly, and I can't believe I did it, and I feel terrible remorse, and it's not who I want to be. It's regrettable. And that's the heart of impulsivity, is you're saying and doing these things that later you deeply regret from the core, this sense of, oh, that's not what I meant to do. I don't want to do that.
С какого возраста стоит обратить внимание на проблему эмоциональной импульсивности? Если ребенок 4-10 лет становится агрессивным до или после сильного эмоционального состояния, даже позитивного, в этом случае можно говорить о расстройстве?
I think every kid is more impulsive and less constrained. And much of parenting involves teaching your kids to have constraint. So then how do you know if your kid has more problems than other kids? I think that's very hard. And there's a lot of debate right now about how early you can measure this. There's a huge study in the United States called the ABCD study that is tracking people from ages like 7 and 8 and doing all kinds of neuroimaging and following them over time. And they included a measure of emotion-related impulsivity in that study with thousands of kids, and had their parents rate them. And we looked at that data and we did not feel like the measure was very reliable, that it showed the correlations we would have expected it to show. Other people have looked at those same correlations and said, oh, well, you know, you'd expect it to be lower at 8. I feel like the correlations are so small, I don't even want to begin to try and focus on that in my science. But certainly by the time kids are more like 11 and 12, we see that parents can identify pretty reliably who has this, and the teachers can reliably identify it, and it's stable, it's predictive of a year later, and it's predictive of many different poor outcomes a year later. So I think when kids get into that kind of 11, 12 year, 13 year range, at least when it's very severe, we can pick up on it and we could probably be doing more to teach those kids skills.
Каким способом на тренинге происходит тренировка совладания с эмоциями? Приоритет отдается сублимации или чему-то еще?
Oh, that's lovely. We haven't worked on sublimation, so we've worked on a couple things. One is helping people just understand that many of the things they're regretting, many of their behaviors that they're regretting, are happening just only during these high arousal states, to help understand, like, you're not a bad person. You're not just randomly making mistakes. It's just hard for you to control these moments. So that's step one. And the first time I worked with a client and explained that, she got out of her chair and hugged me. She was so relieved. So helping them understand those are the moments we need to target, then helping them identify high arousal moments. And there, what we've been doing is having people, we send them an email, like a text on their phone 4 times a day and say, what's your emotion state? Let's do a check-in. We teach them to kind of scan their body, think about, how's your heart rate? How's your sense of calmness? How's your sense of jitters? What are you feeling? 4 times a day, just keep checking, keep paying attention to it. Combining that with procedures to kind of do things like deep breathing, relaxation, to kind of say, okay, let's think about how low you are, how high you are, get better at recognizing those high arousal states. Some people are already pretty darn good about recognizing them, but if they're not good, helping them really pinpoint those, helping them think ahead, like, okay, what are the triggers for you of those high arousal states? Is it being in a room with your mom? Is it when your kid is misbehaving? Is it when you're driving? Like, what are the things that set it off, so you can have a little bit more early warning that this is a high risk situation? And then we do we haven't done sublimation. That's really interesting. We've done very much more in that moment. What's the thing you could do to take 10 breaths, to relax your shoulders, to stop thinking in your brain about how much your mom upsets you, and instead shift gears, focus on something very concrete, like just ground yourself, feel this desk, take a deep breath. Very simple, not behavioral, not cognitive strategies. We have a lot of people who try meditation, who try relaxation, and then we monitor. 4 times a day, once they're learning those skills, we ping them, we say, how are you feeling? Have you had any high arousal moments in the last several hours? If you did, what did you try doing? Tell us on a scale of 0 to 10 how well that worked. So we begin to say, okay, of the different things you've tried, here's the things that worked best. And often people do things that don't work for them at all. And we can show them the graph that says, do you realize that every time you said, okay, I'm going to go for a run, you actually came home just as upset? So helping them understand what are the things that are most consistently helping them feel calmer very quickly in that moment. They're not long-term strategies. They're short-term, let's plug something in for 5 or 10 minutes and see how we do. It's not so different than the kinds of techniques that Marcia Linehan writes about in her treatment manuals on dialectical behavior therapy. But we're shorter. She spends 2 years, we spend 2 weeks, and see if we can make a dent.
Вы говорили, что люди с эмоциональной импульсивностью часто страдают разными психическими или психологическими расстройствами. Но не наоборот ли импульсивность как следствие и проявление болезни?
It absolutely can. But I think there's a couple things to think about there. That's a great question. So we've done a couple things. One is we've asked the question of, does the impulsivity is it still there once people's symptoms recover? It is. So it seems like a more long-term pattern than just whether they're depressed in the moment or whether they're abusing substances in the moment. The other thing is that there are now probably 7 large studies where they followed more than 1,000 people to say, if we pick up on somebody who has emotion-related impulsivity in middle school or as they're starting college, does that predict who's going to go from a state of not being symptomatic to having symptoms? And they can show that before the problems start, emotion-related impulsivity, when it's there in middle school, predicts which kids are going to start drinking earlier, which kids are going to have more drinking problems, which kids are going to have more drug problems. At 18, it predicts who's going to begin to self-harm. At 10, it predicts who's going to begin to have a suicide attempt. So it's there first in some cases and predicts these things coming on. And then the other thing I would say that's really interesting to me is that it predicts so many different problems. So it's not just that it sets the stage for one problem, but it predicts the onset of many different problems depending on kind of the emotions and environment that a person is in. So it's a very broad vulnerability that could then help explain many, many different syndromes and psychopathologies, whether we're talking about gambling, alcohol problems, drug problems, aggression problems, depression, bipolar, suicidality. I don't think it causes bipolar disorder at all. I think bipolar disorder is very clearly heritable with a set of its own genes. But in bipolar disorder, it probably tells a lot of the story of then how well do you do in between your episodes and whether you have these different outcomes. So I hope that helps. It's a great question. And both are true. So once somebody has, say, a depression, I think this gets much worse. Once somebody is in a manic episode, I think this gets much worse. When somebody's drinking, I think it gets much worse. So I do think it's bidirectional. It's going to go both directions.
Эмоции не могут проявляться сами по себе. Вначале все равно возникают какие-то мысли.
You know, 100 years of philosophy and science haven't resolved that one. I think the answer is both can happen. You know, because I think Lang for many, 100 years ago showed that if you change somebody's psychophysiology, it's easier for them to have an emotion. But it's also if you plant a thought, that sets the stage for emotion. So I think there's a lot of routes into emotion probably, and I'm probably not going to be the one who resolves that 100-year puzzle of science. But it's a fun puzzle. It's a good puzzle. So.
А разве импульсивность – это не триггер травмы? Проработка травмы может замедлить реагирование импульсивного поведения?
I think that's very true. I think that's very true. And it's something we haven't done. And it's something that's probably the biggest criticism of the psychotherapy work we're doing, because we're looking for kind of these very concrete kind of techniques to gain a little bit better control. But we may be completely missing big picture problems these people have had with serious trauma that needs to be addressed. Now, I'm not opposed to somebody doing that trauma work. I think it can be very powerful and very important. But what I would say is it's long-term work. It's hard work. I've done work with traumatized women. I've done work with military veterans. it takes a lot of time and energy. And in the meanwhile, if I could work with somebody for 6 weeks and help them stop making as many mistakes that are kind of hurting their current life, that feels like a really important thing to do first. And then maybe you get more room to go back and look at some of these other things. So in my ideal world, like if this was somebody I loved, I think I'd want to kind of give them some of the skills we're working on very, very quickly, help them quit like lashing out at their partner, lashing out at their kid, doing things in the car, doing things that later just spiral, and their sense of kind of low self-esteem, help them stabilize a little bit. And then hopefully that gives them more space in their life to look at kind of early experiences. So I'm not tackling that part. I would love to work with somebody who wanted to kind of tackle that part and see what it did for emotion related impulsivity too. And I think in the long run, probably some combination of some of these very specific self-calming techniques and some of the kind of bigger picture looking at, okay, and what is it that really, you know, was your life experience that may have made you more vulnerable would be important for the people who have trauma. And it's, I would just say that not everybody who has high emotion related impulsivity also reports a trauma. It's varied. So, but when they have that, I'd love to see them have both.
Интересно, когда я покачиваюсь, это как будто ощущается как обсессивно-компульсивное расстройство и еще больше заводит в неприятное негативное состояние.
I'm sorry, I missed the first phrase, Nadia. Can you say it again? Interesting. So, you know, it's so individual, right? What coping strategies help any of us with our mood is really something that works well for me, for example, is being on my bike. And for other people, they would hate that. You know, for some people, rocking works, and some people it wouldn't. So, as a therapist, I'm always trying to give people choices. I give them the idea of what we're trying to do, and then I say, you are going to be your own best expert on what works. And we're going to gather data and we're going to kind of be scientists about thinking about what's the best possible strategy for you. And that's part of why we're using this monitoring several times a day. We can give people graphs that say, okay, you know, for you, rocking is a miserable solution, but every time you use this strategy, it worked really well for you. So yeah, it's fascinating. Like it's very hard to predict for any one human what's going to be the best strategy for them. And I really appreciate that you shared that.
Есть ли исследования по связи паразитологии и повышенной эмоциональной возбудимости у зараженных гельминтами людей? Вы уделяете этому внимание в вашей практике?
I love that. Yeah, so I'm thinking about toxoplasmosis because those folks and those animals show kind of fearless behavior. My understanding about that particular parasitic response is that they don't actually experience the emotion. So when they interview people who became reckless after having that, they're clearly impulsive, but they will say that they do things like they walk out in traffic because they feel no fear. So I think that they have a different thing. And I don't know if there are other parasites that would leave intact your emotion system, but then take away your constraint system. That is a totally fascinating question. I don't know the answer. I would be fascinated to know the answer. It's a great question. And by the way, I am always happy to have people reach out to me, to ask questions. I love collaborating. I'm going to put my email in the chat. So let me send that. You can always reach out to me. I'd love to understand more about what this looks like in your culture, in your experience with your clinical wisdom, and to hear different perspectives, because I hope I've convinced you. I think we have a really important dimension here, but it's also the case that we don't understand everything about it. And it's going to take a lot of people linking arms and trying to figure it out. And so I want to be at that hub of encouraging people to take different perspectives. Already today, there's been a lot of fascinating ideas of things I would never have come to on my own, and I think are very valid and very, very interesting.
Есть ли связь между эмоциональной импульсивностью и нарциссическим расстройством?
There is some correlation for sure, because narcissists, when they're angry, can reach out, can flail. Some of them don't seem to have a lot of regret, others do. The one that actually seems very correlated, with correlations that are about 0.65, is borderline personality disorder. Those folks seem to show profound impulsive responses to their emotion states, and to anger, to sadness. So if there's one particular syndrome that's most emblematic of this, it's probably that. And we didn't even touch it today. There's too much to cover. I realize we're almost out of time now, which I feel badly about. I'd love to be able to hear more and talk more.
На данный момент в чате я вижу один вопрос. Это вопрос, как реагировать на агрессию подростков, например, учителю в классе.
Well, I think when we see that there's a pattern there, I think we can help them first by, kind of figuring out, is this something they regret? Do they want to have better control? And then if it is, some of these tools and strategies might be worth chatting with them about. If what they're trying to do, though, on the other hand, is just kind of rebel and they don't feel any remorse or guilt, these strategies are probably not the direction. So.
Есть какая-нибудь информация об эмоциональной импульсивности у истероидных пациентов?
I haven't seen it. I don't know the answer to that. It'd be an interesting one to know. I have not seen that particular thing, and that would be really, really intriguing.
Применяется ли метод десенсибилизации и переработки движений глаз?
I don't. I'm not trying to jump in and address traumas. If I were, I'd probably use some form of exposure-based treatment. When I've done those exposure-based treatments, I tend to do it without the hand movement. So I just do prolonged exposure when I'm working with trauma. But I haven't done trauma-focused treatment with emotion-related impulsivity. And that I just think would be fascinating to look at and try. That's just completely intriguing and seems totally like an intriguing scientific question.
Как реагировать на всплески ярости и гнева взрослого человека? Есть ли какие-то техники?
Well, one of the things I try and think about is staying calm, because anger is a very high arousal emotion state, and arousal is a little contagious. So when I'm working with a client who's really angry, I'm trying to be very mellow and not add fuel to the fire. If it's anger in the moment, I'm also trying really hard to give the person a chance to tell me what's wrong. I often think of anger directed towards me as a sign that I've made a mistake, and the person feels very powerfully like they need to tell me about that mistake. And so sometimes I can calm things down by saying, all right, I think I've probably made a mistake, and I'm just going to try and understand. I also, though, try and set limits of like, okay, I'm going to try and understand, but I'm going to understand a lot better if we can bring the heat down in this room. So I sometimes will say things like, can we just take a minute, get a drink of water, and I'm going to come back and I'm just going to listen. So that's in the moment, which is a little different than, when it's directed at other people and we're trying to help them recognize the pattern. But it tends to work. And I think, I've worked in a lot of inpatient centers. I've worked with a lot of people with anger problems. And I think one thing that has helped me in that is that naturally I'm pretty calm. And so I'm not somebody who tends to add fuel to the fire. And when I've worked with people, other therapists who are very intense and have a lot of arousal, it's much harder to kind of negotiate anger in the room.
Где можно найти техники работы с эмоциональной импульсивностью и есть ли какая-нибудь литература на эту тему?
So there, I think you'll find a quick snapshot of the things we've done in our articles, one of which was in behavior research and therapy. But I think probably there's two books, two treatment manuals that are really much more elaborate and really helpful. One is by Barlow. I'll put his name in the chat, who tries to kind of provide a therapy for various kinds of emotion problems. And then the other is by Linehan called Dialectical Behavior Therapy. Both are really great resources to have on your bookshelf and to be familiar with.
Можно ли направить излишнюю энергию, вызванную эмоциональной импульсивностью, в позитивное русло? Или это всегда носит только негативный характер, негативные последствия?
That's a great question. I think a lot of emotions have very positive instincts, right? Emotions tell you that something needs to be fixed, or that something's powerful, or that something's meaningful. So emotions are an incredibly important signal. So we never say to people, let's try and get rid of your emotions, because emotions tell you a lot about what is critically important to you. But what we want is for people to feel like they are the ones in the driver's seat of what happens once they're in that emotion state. And they may still decide, you know what? It's time for me to share my anger. It's time for me to share my excitement. It's time for me to share this emotion. It's time for me to display it in a big way. So we're not even opposed to the idea of people displaying big emotion. It's more that we want them to be making the choices and feel like they get to decide, do I want to express this emotion or not? And not to be looking back on it an hour later and going, oh, I hate that I did that. Like, we want them in the driver's seat. So we're very upfront with people that we value emotion expression. We're not trying to rob anyone of that. We just want them to feel like they're in the driver's seat.
Контейнировать эмоции – это изолировать или вытеснять их?
Sometimes one way to think about it is I could be very happy. And I could sustain that happiness while feeling calm. So I could be bouncing off the walls with joy, or I could say, you know what, I'm going to hold this joy, I'm going to savor it, and I'm going to kind of go a little quiet. Same thing with, I might be very angry, I might be very upset, I might be very distressed, and I need to kind of understand that distress. But if I'm in a calmer state, it's easier to hold it out here and look at, okay, what is happening here once I'm a little calmer.
Я думаю, на этом мы будем завершать. Спасибо огромное, Шерри, за ваши ответы, очень содержательные, очень интересные, очень развернутые, очень полные. На этом...
Спасибо за прекрасные вопросы. Еще раз, пожалуйста, не стесняйтесь со мной связаться, если у вас еще остались вопросы. Анна, большое спасибо за вашу модерацию. И хочу выразить благодарность всем, кто нас сегодня слышал. Спасибо, для меня это была большая честь.
Дорогие участники мероприятия, для вас у меня есть еще немножечко информации. Спасибо вам огромное за то, что присоединились на сегодняшнее занятие, на сегодняшнюю встречу. Я думаю, что это было очень полезно и как для развития себя как личности, и для профессиональной позиции. Может быть, кого-то эта тема заинтересует в контексте изучения научного. На этом мы с вами сегодня прощаемся, но уже на следующей неделе, во вторник, состоится встреча с Майклом Джейм Кэмероном, который является сертифицированным поведенческим аналитиком, и мы с вами поговорим о том, как мы принимаем решения. Также обращаю ваше внимание, что кроме мероприятий в рамках факультета психологии, также проводятся мероприятия на факультете современного искусства, дизайна интерьеров, поэтому если вдруг какие-то из тем вас заинтересуют, мы с радостью встретимся с вами также на других занятиях, которые проходят и в среду, и в четверг. А я с вами прощаюсь до следующего вторника. Прекрасной вам недели. Спасибо за участие.